Man's need of God constitutes his highest perfection. From Soren Kierkegaard's 4 Upbuilding Discourses, published August 31st, 1844. Man wants but little here below, nor wants that long, is a high-minded saying, well worthy of acceptance, and worthy also of being accepted as it desires to be accepted. For it is too earnest in its intent to wish to be admired merely as a beautiful sentiment or a neat bit of phrasing. As such, it is indeed sometimes present in our speech. We quote it for the benefit of some needy person, perhaps for the sake of offering him some degree of consolation in passing, perhaps merely for the sake of saying something. We say it to ourselves in the heyday of our prosperity, for the human heart is deceitful, and only too prone to take even high-mindedness in vain, proud of needing little while using much. We say it to ourselves in the day of our need, and we immediately hasten ahead in order to receive ourselves at the goal, when we shall have realized the lofty task. But in this we serve ourselves as little as we honor the saying. Indeed, our need is not for long, but as it sometimes happens that, when the day begins to lengthen, the cold begins to strengthen, so it is always the case that the winter of our deprivation and discontent can make the day seem long, even though life and time be short. How much then is the little that a man needs? It is quite impossible to answer this question in general terms. Even one who has had the experience, if not of needing little, then at least of having to make a little suffice, cannot in general terms determine how much that little is. Just as time often brings new consolation to the sorrowing, new restoration of vigor to the abject, new gains to those who had experienced great losses, so even when it persists in taking away, it nevertheless deals solicitously with the sufferer. It rarely takes everything all at once, but only little by little, thus gradually accustoming him to do without, until at length the sufferer perceives with astonishment that he needs even less than what he once regarded as the absolute minimum. He sees that his wants are now so small that he can remember how he once shrank back in terror from the thought of needing so little, though in this he did not think very clearly, since it is certainly not the smallness of the want that is the truly terrifying thing. He remembers how he once excited and heated his spirit by reflecting upon the contradiction involved in needing so little merely in order to go on needing so little, though in this he did not fully understand himself, since the contradiction could surely not be removed merely by needing more. How much then is the little that a man needs? Let life itself answer the question, and let this discourse do what the sorrows and tribulations of life sometimes effect, namely, the stripping a man of his possessions in order to discover how little he needs. And do you also lend your aid, my hearer, in the degree to which your special circumstances make you able and willing to participate. For the discourse does not wish to overwhelm you with sudden fear, seeing that it is engaged in trying to find consolation, nor does it wish to deceive you, as when the ice and snow of despair create the delusive mountain stream that lures the caravan from the way and leads it into the desert to its destruction. Indeed, it cannot terrify you if you have made trial of the process it is about to describe, and if you have thus found the consolation. And if you have not made the trial, the discourse which confronts you with it can terrify you only if your strength lies in the view that such things happen but seldom. But who then is the more unfortunate? Is it the man who has made the trial of the experience? Or is it not the soft and cowardly fool who cannot perceive that his consolation is an illusion, since when misfortune really comes it helps him little that the occurrence was a rare one? Let us then take it away from him, wealth and power and influence, and the deceitful service of false friendship, and the obedient subjection of his pleasures to the whim of his desires, and the triumphs of his vanity over the admiration of his worshippers, and the flattering attention of the throngs, and the envied magnificence of his entire presence. Now he has lost it, and is content with less. Just as the world cannot recognize him on account of the great alteration in his circumstances, so he finds it hard to recognize himself, so changed is he, that he who once needed so much now needs so little. In truth, it is far easier to understand and much more cheerful to contemplate how this latter change can make him unrecognizable to himself than how that the other change, the change in his circumstances, can make him unrecognizable to other men. For what folly there is in the notion that a human being should be known solely by his clothes, so that men do not recognize him when he is unclothed. And is it not a melancholy thing that our admiration is reserved for the clothes, and not centered upon the man? A more godly view of life, however, readily perceives that the man is about to be clothed upon, and to be clad in festal garments, for the earthly wedding garment and the heavenly are very different. But a little with contentment is a great gain. Let us then take that too from him, not the contentment, but the little that is left. He does not suffer want. He is not compelled to go hungry to bed, but he does not know from whence his needs are to be supplied, either in the evening when he falls asleep from his anxiety, or in the morning when he wakes to live with it. Nevertheless, his wants are somehow supplied, the little that he needs in order to live. He is a poor man, and this phrase, which it is so hard to hear, he must hear applied to himself. He feels the burden of his poverty doubly, since it is not self-chosen. He is not like a man who renounced his wealth in order to try an experiment, and who perhaps therefore finds himself more easily in his self-chosen poverty, though not necessarily more excellently, if perchance he merely renounced one form of vanity in order to acquire another and a greater. Man wants but little, says the proverb, but to know that one's wants are few, without in any moment knowing with certainty that these few wants will be supplied. Whoever is able to carry this burden needs but little. He does not even need that which nevertheless is something, namely, to have the satisfaction of his few wants assured to him. A man needs no more if it is true that he needs only a little in order to live. For when the time comes, he will doubtless find for himself a grave, and in the grave all men need equally little, whether he owns the grave in which he lies, or has a leasehold for 100 years. Strange contradiction this, or has had to force his way in among others, has had to struggle even in death to find for himself a little place. All have the same amount, all need equally little, and all only need it for a little while. But the short time before, of which the saying speaks, may perhaps seem long. For even if the way that leads to the grave is short, even if you never had occasion to see him wearily walk the path to the grave in order to make conquest with his eye of the little country he intends after death to make his own, might not the way in another sense be very long indeed? And if he sometimes lost his courage and failed to understand at times that man wants but little here below, had you nothing else to say to him than merely to repeat in his ear this one saying? Or did you perhaps have something else to say, something that came so naturally and so easily to your lips, that you found yourself perhaps not fully trusting the consolation you offered him? Namely, the familiar phrase, "Then you will have to be content with the grace of God." Let us pause here a moment, lest everything be thrown into confusion, the thought, our discourse, and the human language itself. Confused, namely, in that the roles are reversed, though the relationship remains the same, so that it is the other who has the consolation while you lack it, the other who is rich while you are needy, though the very opposite seemed to be the case until you heard the little magic word that changed all. Perhaps the word did not even win your attention, for we often use many a word in this manner, as the child uses the significant word without becoming aware of the spear point of the thought, which wounds unto death in order to save the life. To let the grace of God suffice us. The grace of God is surely the greatest of all good gifts. On this point we do not propose to raise a controversy. This belief is at bottom the most earnest and blessed conviction of every human being. But we so rarely evoke the thought, and if we wish to be honest with ourselves, we must admit that in the last analysis, although without fully becoming aware of what we do, we quietly apply to this conception the old adage that too much and too little spoils everything. For if a man were really to think this thought in its eternal validity, it would at once nullify all his worldly thinking, imagining, and desire, and turn everything upside down. And this is something that a man cannot long endure. Hence he falls back to the lower level of earthly things, to his customary speech and habits of thought. And the older he is in years, the harder it is for him to learn a new language, especially one so markedly different. Now and then this comes to his attention, and he senses that there is something wrong about the use which he makes of the word, intermingled as it is with all sorts of worldly speech. He thus acquires a bad conscience with respect to it, and is not happy in its employment. And yet it really is the truth that the grace of God is the most precious of all good gifts. If a man had what is less precious indeed than the grace of God, namely, the entire sum of all the treasures in the world, and you were to be so bold as to admonish him to rest content with this, he would doubtless smile at you. If, on the other hand, he were himself to say, "Now I shall try to be content with what I have," such speech would doubtless seem repugnant, for what more could he ask to possess? And how great the insolence of trying to be content when one has everything! Whatever we are engaged in trying to make suffice must surely be something that is little, and to strive to be content with the most precious of all possessions seems indulgent in a strange mode of speech. And further, this consolation is offered to the other by a man who does not himself appear to understand it. This is as strange as if someone were to offer a needy person the gift of a coin, admonishing him to be content with the gift, although the fact was that this coin was one which made its possessor the owner of the entire world. How strange that the giver could appraise his gift so modestly as to match it with the advice to be content. Is it not as if a man were going to a banquet invited by some great personage, and met on his way a humble person who was not invited, and for the sake of consoling him after a fashion, said to him, "You will have to rest content with the privilege of sitting at table in the kingdom of heaven"? Or if the humble man himself said, "Alas, I am not invited by the great man, nor could I accept the invitation even if I were, for I have a previous engagement, and must content myself with sitting at meat in the kingdom of heaven," would it not be a strange form of speech? The more one thinks about it, the stranger does the earthly life and the human language become, intermingled with all of life's earthly and worldly differences, which are already quite sufficiently insistent upon being taken at their own evaluation. We thoughtlessly permit the distinction of the divine also to make its appearance, and in such a manner as to show that it is at bottom really excluded. When a man comes to us in the name of the King, this authorization opens every door. But it is a last desperate recourse for a man to come to us in God's name, and whoever is compelled to be content with such an authorization must be content with little. If someone came to a great man's door, and the servant failed to make out on what errand he came, and the great man himself came to the door in impatience, and saw standing there a humble man who presented himself as coming in God's name, would not the door in all probability be shut in his face? But the discourse does not wish to startle you, my hearer, nor to shock you out of your continuity with yourself. When we speak of being content with the grace of God, the reason doubtless is that the grace of God does not express itself in our experience as a human being would like, or find it easy to understand, but speaks instead in a more difficult language. When the grace of God grants to a man what he likes and desires, he is not merely content, but happy and grateful. Under such circumstances, he deems himself fully capable of understanding that God is good and gracious. That this is a misunderstanding, to the refutation of which, however, one need never leap too promptly and eagerly, is certain enough. One need not on that account omit to train oneself in the truer and more difficult interpretation, while there is still time and opportunity. If it is possible for a human being to persuade himself of the grace of God without the intermediation of any temporal testimony, or without leaning upon that interpretation of God's providence which makes it profitable for him, according to his own ideas of what is profitable, then indeed it is quite certain that for him the grace of God is the highest good. And he will then strive to rejoice in God's grace so as not merely to rest content with it, and he will give thanks for it so as not merely to find it barely sufficient. He will not grieve over what God has denied to him. He will not be overmuch concerned with the difference in mode of expression which formerly existed between God's everlasting faithfulness and his own childish littleness of faith. For now this difference in language no longer exists, in that his heart is strengthened by grace and not by meat. If someone suffering from some deprivation enjoyed the friendship of a great man, but this powerful friend could do nothing to alleviate his suffering, which is comparable to the grace of God being without external confirmation, the mere fact of his friendship with the great man would nevertheless mean much to him. But here perhaps we touch the difficulty. The sufferer might readily persuade himself that the great man really was unable to do anything for him. But how could any man in any finite sense be persuaded that Almighty God could do nothing for him? Hence it results that our thoughts, in their impatience, steadily insist that God can surely do for us what we wish him to do. And it is because of man's impatience that the language speaks of trying to rest content with the grace of God. In the beginning, when his impatience was at its height, and cried out most loudly to be satisfied, it could scarcely be made to understand that the contentment of which we speak could be praiseworthy. But as the impatience subsided, and the sufferer found rest and peace in the serene incorruptibility of the inner man, he began to understand this more and more, until at last his heart was moved, and he came to behold a vision, even if only intermittently, of the divine glory which had taken upon itself so humble a form. And if this glorious vision vanishes, so that he again becomes a sufferer, as in truth he was even while he beheld the vision, if it again seems to him that it requires a contented spirit to find the grace of God sufficient for his needs, he nevertheless sometimes admits to himself, with shame, that the grace of God is something that one may well find worthy of one's contentment. Aye, that it is of all things most worthy to be desired. Aye, that it is of all things most blessed to possess. So then it happens, little by little, for the grace of God can never be seized by force, that the human heart becomes in a very beautiful sense more and more discontented, more and more burning with desire, more and more filled with longing for the assurance of the grace of God. And behold, now all things have become new. Everything is changed. In the case of the earthly goods of life, the principle obtains that man needs but little, and in proportion as he needs less and less, he becomes more and more perfect. A pagan, who knew only how to speak of earthly things, has said that God was happy because he needed nothing at all, and next to him in happiness was the wise man, because he needed little. But in the relation between a human being and God, this principle is reversed. The more a man needs God, the more perfect he is. The word which speaks of letting the grace of God suffice us is by no means intent merely upon offering us consolation, and upon reaffirming this consolation whenever earthly want and deprivation makes it seem necessary. For when a human being has fully awakened to its import, it calls him aside to a place where he no longer hears the earthly mother tongue of the worldly mind, nor the customary speech of men, nor the alarums of the actors on the stage of life. But he stands now where the world is glorified, and confides to him the secret of perfection, namely, that to be in need of God is no shameful embarrassment, but precisely the perfection of human life, and that it would be the saddest of all tragedies if a man passed through life without discovering that he needed God. That was from Edifying Discourses, a selection by Soren Kierkegaard, translated by David F. and Lillian Marvin Swenson, edited with an introduction by Paul L. Holmer, Harper Torch Books, New York. Copyright 1958, pages 136 to 145. The whole discourse goes from page 136 to 176. Offered for educational purposes only.